Congress should carefully and thoughtfully pursue the types of reforms that are right for the American people. Our nation is comprised of good and decent people who want their government's leaders to fulfill their promises and advance an immigration policy that serves the national interest.
All right, that was Attorney General Jeff Sessions earlier today saying that the DREAMer program, as it's called, the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, extending it for 6 months. Congress then come up with a solution. In other words, punting this back to Congress to do what it should have done, the administration says, in the first place, and not allow President Obama to come up with the executive order that shielded these 800,000 to 1 million young men and women because they came here with their parents illegally to suffer the consequences. Center for Immigration Studies Executive Director Mark Krikorian on all of that. Mark, where do you think this is going, let's say 6 months from now?
Well, it's a good question, and it's up to Congress, which is where it should have been in the first place. The question of whether DACA is advisable is separate from the question of whether people who came here as young children and have grown up here as Americans should get an amnesty or not. Those are two separate questions. DACA is simply illegal. Even President Obama himself, the year before he issued it, acknowledged that what would become DACA was not an appropriate use of his power. For political expediency, he changed his mind. So this, frankly, is letting the DACAs down easy, this 6-month grace period before anything happens, and then it would be 2 more years if Congress does nothing, where people's work permits would expire. So the last DACA would not lose his work permit for fully 2.5 years from now. That's plenty of a grace period for Congress to get off the stick and do something.
Yeah, you would think, right? The other issue that's come up here is whether any of them forget about losing their work permits during that time or after that time. What about losing their status as seen in the eyes of many as Americans, and that they'd be deported? That seems extremely unlikely to me, but
yeah.
What do you think?
Yeah, no, I mean, some will. If they end up getting, caught up with the law or something like that, they could be deported. Some DACA holders have already been deported because they got involved in gangs or they slipped through the cracks somehow, through the vetting and got a DACA work permit. But generally speaking, it's not as though Homeland Security is going to print out a list of addresses for ICE to go and round up people who had DACA. I mean, that's just a silly scare tactic. The administration itself has said they're not interested in doing that. And, I mean, that's just not the way ICE operates. So that's simply not going to happen. Some will, in fact, end up being deported, but it won't be that many. It's just not going to happen.
New York and Washington State are 2 states that are suing over this, of the president taking this decision. South Carolina, interestingly enough, and its attorney general says it will drop plans to sue over DACA, over the president's decision. And I'm just wondering where those states, the 2 that are remaining that do look to sue, on what grounds? What would they be arguing?
I have no idea what they'd be arguing because there was literally no legal grounds for a lawsuit. This was not, DACA was not, it wasn't even an executive order. It wasn't even a regulation, which has a formal process in law of issuing it.
What was it?
Was nothing but a memo.
What did President Obama do?
It was a memo. That's all it was. DHS wrote a 2- or 3-page memo. It's online, and that's it. And so the president has every authority to cancel the memo issued by a previous administration. Now, this is not to say that they won't find some judge who basically would just make up whatever he wants and try to enjoin this. That's not impossible, but it would be one more indication of how lawless our judiciary has become.
I always think that the media, I would always safely say not Fox, but has such a crazy overreaction to something, or everything gets the racist stamp, anything approaching a crackdown or returning to the norm, as was the case before President Obama issued this executive memorandum, whatever you call it, where I think one commentator was saying the Statue of Liberty is crying today. Really? Doesn't that get in the way itself of solving this problem when we frame it that way?
Of course it does. And frankly, this is a sympathetic group of illegal immigrants. They're a special case, really. They're unlike any other illegal immigrants. And their situation could have been fixed years ago if the people pushing the DREAM Act, which was the legislative version of what became DACA, had been willing to engage in a little give and take. In other words, say, okay, let's include a e-verify mandate. This is an online system that helps businesses make sure they hire people who are legally here. The system exists, but Congress has to make it mandatory for it to be mandatory. The president can't do that. So people who wanted to push the DREAM Act could have been able to say, look, let's join E-Verify with the DREAM Act and see if we can get enough people to push this through. No, it was all or nothing, our way or the highway, and they ended up with nothing. I mean, this is the consequence of a kind of maximalist effort to get everything they want without any willingness to compromise or give anywhere else. And these young people, they're not children, despite what the politicians say. They're all in their 20s and 30s, but these young people are the one paying the price for that.
All right, now, again, you think 6 months would be enough time for Congress to come up with something, but I know the history of Congress under either or both parties, the time can pass quickly without anything getting done. If nothing gets done, do we revert back to the law the way it was?
Yes, absolutely. What happens 6 months from now, the first people whose work permits expire, the DACAs whose permits expire on March 6th, which is the first date stuff would happen, they would lose it. And so you'd have some several hundred people each day have their work permits expire. And they would end up, if they're working, and some of them are working, they would have to leave their jobs or continue to work illegally. So it will have an effect, but it'll be a process, not just a one-day event.